Good afternoon. It is July 1st, 2022. It is a Friday, and I'm departing from how I have done things before in the past, mostly because I don't have time to do a video, nor do I have the inclination to do a video. I just wanted to record my thoughts quickly before I go about doing the adult stuff that I have to do. Not adult stuff in a interesting way. It's the more mundane stuff of cleaning house, doing chores, all sorts of stuff. But I just wanted to sit down and kind of capture my thoughts. I recently watched Combat Obscura. It's a documentary filmed by Marines that were in Afghanistan in 2011. And just kind of capture some observations that I had during the filming. Videos like this are fascinating because it really captures how mundane things can be in a very chaotic situation or a chaotic scenario that most people don't get to experience. That could be thankfully, it's a good thing that people don't have to experience this. And it's also a good thing that these Marines captured the shenanigans that goes on with stuff like that, but also the risk that they put themselves into during combat deployments. I've had discussions with Dave periodically about what defines a combat veteran. And I think that one of the things that has kind of evolved in my perspective on that, is that you kind of have to specify when you say combat veteran, you have to specify what combat they were a veteran of. You could say that you're a Cold War veteran, and I made light of the different hierarchies of veterans as a result of a discussion with Dave. But in watching Combat Obscura, it kind of got me to thinking about the intensity of combat and how we have enjoyed a relative disparity of power on the battlefield in the combat that we've endured for the last 20 years. If you think about videos like these that capture the experiences that American soldiers and Marines have gone through, you see that we've enjoyed a lot of superiority in terms of air dominance, in terms of firepower, in terms of technology, in terms of a whole bunch of things. And while I was never... It's kind of hard to define my experience, because I did VIP transports, very important person transport, in Afghanistan in 04-05. But there was times where we actually had to support special forces guys. And in situations like that, in the one situation that comes to mind, it's really hard to differentiate between combat veteran and people like me, because I never knowingly had rounds fired at me with intent. Now, flying around in a helicopter in Iraq and in Afghanistan, medevac in both tours in Iraq, there's times where the defensive systems on the aircraft would engage because the sensors would detect the parameters that would indicate a possible launch of a missile towards us. One of the things that we typically did as soon as the flares would deploy was we would look for smoke trails. Didn't see any. I've never seen tracers, but then again, talking to a lot of the special forces guys, the insurgents or the bad guys, whatever description that they had at the time, they typically didn't use tracers. So you wouldn't know that you were shot at until you came back with bullet holes. And if I figure out how to do this video and include some pictures, I will. But there's no way of knowing that you were shot at directly. There's been a handful of times, maybe more than a handful, I don't know. Honestly, the three deployments kind of blend in, but there have been times where I've been in situations where people could have taken opportunity shots at me because I'm standing outside of a helicopter, right outside of Baji, or right outside of any one of these cities or villages or sides of roads in Afghanistan with burned out buildings or all sorts of potential observation areas where you're exposed to direct fire or IEDs. You never know. You never really know. There was one time in Afghanistan where I actually had the door gun, the M60D, that was my responsibility. That was my weapon for that deployment. I had a belt of 200 rounds of 7.62 by 51. It was a 1-to-4 tracer mix, meaning every fourth round was a tracer. I think for that deployment, somebody had managed to get a hold of some armor-piercing rounds, so I think it was a 1 round of tracer, 1 round of API, and then 3 rounds or 4 rounds of just regular full metal jacket. I think we scrounged that up, and I made that the standard for all the door guns. That way, there was no fussing around with trying to figure out which box had the armor-piercing ammo. You just distributed evenly across all the ammo. But anyway, there was one time where I was actually we were orbiting around a village somewhere in the northeastern part of Afghanistan, and I had my weapon pointed at a guy who was hiding behind a tree, safety off, fingers on the trigger, just waiting for him to raise the barrel of his AK. And we sat there, and I don't know how I lost track of how many orbits we did. That's the funny thing about situations like that, is I can sit here and I can close my eyes, and I can visualize every single detail down to the green awnings, the white awnings, how many awnings there were in this small little valley village. I can tell you that you could describe the clothes, but you're describing the clothes for pretty much everybody who wasn't U.S. military or who was just part of the rural population. But I remember the tree was maybe about a third of the width that he was. He was hiding behind this small sapling, and I was sitting there. He was keeping that stupid small tree in between him and I, as we hovered maybe about 200 yards. Not hovered, but we did hover at first, but then we started. I think I admonished the pilots because I didn't like the fact that we were staying still. I was kind of a jerk because if we got too high, I was getting after the pilots, yelling at them that we were too high, if we were too low, or if we were too slow. But it was good because in actuality, and thinking back on it, we kept a very unpredictable pattern. There was no way to telegraph where we were going because we didn't even know where we were going. All we knew is that the guy on the left side of the helicopter, me, was getting more and more agitated that this guy was hiding behind a tree with a rifle, but he did not have the rifle up into a firing position. And we had a whole bunch of special forces guys on board our helicopter, and afterwards they said, they couldn't understand why I just didn't shoot him. Well, he wasn't taking any steps or any motions that put him into the parameters of being able to be engaged in accordance with the rules of engagement. But not only that, I distinctly remember, and that was part of the decision on why I didn't shoot, that there was a pathway maybe about 50, 60 feet from him where all the non-combatants, all the old people, all the kids, all the women, they were using that pathway to leave this village. And that's what really drew our attention to this village at first. We started orbiting because I think somebody in the other helicopter, we had 2 Blackhawks and 2 Apaches. And either somebody in our helicopter, one of the passengers, maybe it was me, that just noticed something, and we decided that we were going to just start orbiting, because that was the whole mission. It was just to bring the special forces on the route that they normally took on vehicles up valleys that even they themselves said the Afghans will let you up the valleys, but they don't have to let you out. So it was kind of breaking their patrol routine in doing something different, because now we had the element of surprise and speed. But I didn't take the shot because there's no way. The M60, while it was a great weapon, if you maintained it properly, it wasn't a point weapon. It was a suppressive weapon, especially if it was being fired out of a moving helicopter. There was no guarantee that I was going to be able to engage that guy without hitting some of the non-combatants, some of the old people, or women or kids. And the funny thing is it's not really backwards justification, because a lot of things happen really fast. And you choose to do something, you choose not to do something based on the moment. But at the same time, you understand that you have a big responsibility. And if you miss, you're really going to make the life hard for any patrols that go in that valley, because the helicopters came in and just mowed down a whole bunch of non-combatants. Was I smart enough to say that at 29, what was it? No, I was 31, 33, 32. Was I smart enough to make that determination at the moment? No, not really. Maybe I was, maybe I wasn't. I don't know. But that's not the point. The point goes back to veterans. I don't consider myself a combat veteran, even though by any stretch of the definition, I think I actually fall under that. But going back to what I said earlier, where I was going earlier with this, is it depends on the countries. Early on in the start of this whole stuff that's going on in Ukraine, there was a lot of people in the United States who were veterans or closely associated with the veteran community that were itching to go to Ukraine to go and fight the Russians. Many of them actually went. And I have had my reservations about that. They could do whatever they want. I don't really care. Do I think it's a good idea? No, I didn't think it was a good idea then. I think it's even stupider now. Because the combat that we had to experience in Afghanistan and Iraq, I don't care what the MOS was, the military occupational specialty. I don't care what the job was or what the level of combat was. There was nothing in Afghanistan or Iraq, or even probably Syria, that would be comparable to anything that people were going to experience in Ukraine. And it shows. Air superiority determines a lot in combat. So there's not really one side that has definite air superiority. That's the problem with the conflict over there, is you have a lot of equipment that's very similar. It's used by both sides. Both sides use MI8s, MI17s. Both sides use MiG-29s, Su-27s, etc., etc. It's almost impossible to tell when you're looking at videos if it's a Ukrainian BMP or a Russian BMP. And that, I think, is probably one of the more difficult to understand issues that I have with this conflict, because it is nothing but a propaganda war. It's an information war, and you're dealing with an information war on a target audience that can't figure out how to be discerning in the news or the images or the narrative that's being presented. And I'm always going to be critical of people who just buy what they see and take it for face value. But that goes back into, that returns once again back to what I'm saying about how the conflict in Ukraine is not ever going to be anything close to what we can experience or what we have experienced in American military history since probably some cases of the Vietnam War, some cases of the Korean War, and definitely the Second World War, where you have debilitating and immobilizing and demoralizing artillery, both tube and rocket. And for people who don't understand the difference between tube artillery and rocket artillery, is that tube artillery is basically what you would think, a cannon. Rocket artillery is basically any kind of rocket, which could be an RPG-7, shoulder-fired, man-portable, or all the way up to 107 millimeter or larger. That's where you get into the theater ballistic missiles that are just conventional warheads. Those haven't been used all that much, but it also includes, to a certain extent, the unconventional applications of airborne rockets, meaning unguided rockets that are fired from helicopters or aircraft that are being pitched up and fired indiscriminately at a 30-degree angle so that they come and land miles downrange in a very unpredictable pattern. It's basically a case of, hey, I hate everybody in that general direction. I don't care about anybody in that general direction. I'm just going to volley off 36 rockets or more. So, what does that mean for the receiving end? This is where I'm going when it comes to combat veterans. Because combat veterans who have experienced that level of indirect fire, combat veterans who have been in a situation where there is no air superiority, there is no, let's call in an A-10, let's call in an AC-130, let's call in F-15s or whatever, when there's not that option to get you out automatically. The other part of this that I was noting was my own reaction every time there was a requirement for medevac. They medevaced a guy out who had superficial wounds, and honestly, a lot of times we did move people with a lot of superficial wounds. I could go back through my logbook, and maybe that's what I would do one day, is just kind of keep the audio recorder going as I go through the Excel spreadsheet that I made back in 2004, and just talk about what that logbook means to me and what some of those entries mean to me, and the amazing power of recollection that comes from documenting stuff like that. But that distracted me from what I was saying. The level of combat that we've experienced is nothing like what people have experienced in the past, what people are experiencing in the present, and what people will experience in the future. And this puts us in a very, very dangerous situation because this is what we think combat is. So then we would have the understandable but idiotic attitude of some veterans thinking that what goes on in Iraq and what went on in Iraq and Afghanistan is going to be a sufficient level of preparation for going into someplace like Ukraine. It's not. It will not. It never will be. I remember where I was going. My reaction with the medevac flights is that it would be interesting to watch my reaction being recorded and watch where my eyes are looking and watch what my hands are doing. Because I catch myself every once in a while when I do watch videos like that, where they're inside of a helicopter or they're walking up to a helicopter, my hands do start to, I'll intertwine my hands kind of like a, I don't know, not like, just interlace your fingers and make a fist. But what happens with me is I typically forget that I'm watching stuff like this and I'm not actually there, because my hands will start getting sore because I'm just squeezing my own hands. I do notice that I'm moving my eyes a lot more as I'm looking at all the details that I can see through the screen. I think I caught myself a couple of times leaning over trying to look around to see what was around the edge of the field of vision for the camera. But that goes to illustrate what I'm talking about. That my definition of what combat is and what the definition of combat is presently in Ukraine, and hopefully confined to Ukraine, and hopefully confined to Ukraine with a very quick and humane and non-lingering resolution. Hopefully it'll be over soon. But yeah, I don't know. I think that when I think about the people I went with and the people that are in the military now, and I'm not discrediting the whole military. I'm not discrediting the Army, the Navy, the Marines, the Coast Guard, the Air Force, or the Space Force. As much as I'd like to belittle the latter, whatever, not my problem. I'm not looking to tear them down. I'm just making an observation that when you see the type of training or the emphasis that's being pushed on a public face for recruiting, for what the values have become versus what I remember them as, that's what has me very, very concerned. That's what causes me to cringe as I think about what the second and third order effects are of failed diplomatic resolution, or continued posturing that puts us in a situation where it's just people who are geopolitical lunatics or nitwits trying to save face. What happens when we realize through direct experience how many artillery shells or how many artillery pieces, both rocket and tube, are pointed at Seoul? what happens when we realize that China is not as efficient as we were led to believe, but they're not as incompetent as we would hope in using their converted merchant ships for an amphibious assault on Taiwan. Or what happens when, and I wrote about this, and I've had to go back and reread it a couple of times, but what happens when Article 5 gets pushed for NATO? So, yeah. Combat Obscura was a very interesting video. Excuse me. It was a very fascinating look into a deployment that I probably could have gone on, and I still wonder if I should have gone on it. But that deployment happened when I had orders to go to Fort Benning, and when I was asked if I wanted to go, my response was, if people would like me to go, then I'll go. Well, I didn't go. Funny that the command element that I had back in Hawaii at the time, the command element that I was constantly fighting against, it seemed, because their priorities were not what I felt they needed to be, what a lot of people felt they needed to be. I think that they were lulled into thinking that Afghanistan was just going to be another Iraq deployment, and the Iraq deployment in 2009, 2010 was kind of a joke, because we were just basically backfilling in case there were patrols, but by then we had already dialed back a lot of the patrols. So there was not really that same frantic activity that we had in 06, 07 in Iraq during the surge and during the big push to tamp down the insurgency. So I don't think they were taking it seriously. But going back to that command element, I thought it was very interesting that we're coming up, and it just occurred to me, we're coming up on the 10-year anniversary of that whole command element getting relieved in Afghanistan. They got relieved. The commander, the first sergeant, and the executive officer got relieved during a combat deployment for loss of confidence. And those were the same ones that were driving me crazy before I left Hawaii. So I think it's very interesting that I record this almost 10 years to the day, July 4th, 2012. I bring that up only because, and I want to make it clear that I am glad they got relieved, because they were the type of people that would get people killed. And I was convinced that they were going to get people killed. But I was doing everything I could to mitigate that, as far as training goes, as far as what my standards of performing duties as a crew member was for the backseaters that I could influence change on. So yeah, I'm glad they got relieved. And I do realize that this whole not video audio thing is kind of rambling a little bit, but I wanted to capture what my reactions are, and I want to give people a little bit of perspective, not for my own sake, but for their own sake, of what they overlook, what they neglect to acknowledge, or what they have no idea they don't know about. And maybe a different perspective might bring into question whether or not being blindly devoted towards interventionism or isolationism is a good thing. Is it a good thing to stay out of conflict before it gets too big? That's the interesting thing. That's the interesting question for this. Do you get involved in a small regional conflict to keep it from getting bigger, or do you avoid getting involved because your involvement might make it bigger? It would be interesting to hear what other people's perspectives are on this, because I do not live in a bubble. Well, I live in a bubble of congestion right now, as you can tell. But that's something I'm going to ponder. And I would like you to ponder it as well. For the time being, I have chores that I have to go do. You have a great 4th of July weekend. Pay attention. Think for yourself.